Okay, all right, great. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Omar Samko. I am an instructional technologist at Teaching and Learning Technology, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. On behalf of the 2022 Rutgers University Online Learning Conference, I welcome Shelley Bookbinder and Emily Bands from the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. We're pleased to have them present faux-flipping a work-based training, lessons from pandemic adaptations. And during the presentation, please engage using the chat function rather than the Q&A function. And if you have any questions, please throw them into the chat. And be sure that you are in the session chat rather than the event chat today. Shelley and Emily, thank you again. Please take it away.
Thank you, Omar. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emily Vance. My colleague Shelley is the other person whose video you can see. And we are going to be speaking with you on our experience using a faux-flipped method while providing a work-based training that we provide twice a year on top of other times. So this is coming from the pandemic. I'm not going to go into too in-depth right now because we talk a lot about this within our presentation. But this was our experience and how we use this faux-flipping method on our training series. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a problem. The problem was we were first doing these trainings in person. And then we had to get into a remote training and making that switch. Shelley is going to discuss with you the faux-flipped training adaptations and how we kind of came about making this change and what we did to make the adaptations, the results, and then the implications for practice and for research. So before we get into the faux-flipping, we wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of our community support services training. So as Omar mentioned, Shelley and I work for the Department of Counseling and Psychiatric Rehabilitation Professions. I don't know why I completely blanked on that for a second there. And we work on a grant-funded project through the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services, where we provide training and technical assistance to mental health providers who work in New Jersey. And what we provide is work-based training. So this is a training that is mandated for supportive housing providers who work in New Jersey. And the Community Support Services, which is the supportive housing program, are services to help people with serious mental health conditions. So the staff are going out into individuals' homes and providing support services to them under the Community Support Services umbrella. Everybody lives independently in the community in a home of their choice. Sometimes people have roommates, sometimes people don't have roommates. Community support services is really based off of evidence-based practices as well as documentation. There's a lot of focus and emphasis on different therapeutic techniques like cognitive behavioral strategies, motivational interviewing, as well as illness management and recovery. What we train on initially was a presentation with content and application, and that was a 6-hour in-person session. Because of the pandemic, our training had to move to remote. And when this initially happened, we had just finished our last in-person session, we'll say, and we were going into our 8th and final session. So we were very quickly able to, and when I say when this happened, I'm referring to March 2020, if anybody doesn't remember March 2020. But we were going into our 8th session of the training. So we were able to very quickly do an asynchronous review of the training and the content that was discussed throughout the training. But we knew with the changes from the pandemic that things were really going to change in the future from when we did this training again in the fall. So as I said, we had those 2 trainings left and we were able to move. And then we had these questions, right? These questions of how do we restructure this training now that's 6 hours in person to a remote training? We obviously can't train people for 6 hours on camera. I don't know if anybody has been in any classes or if you're teaching classes or any trainings at all, but I mean, Shelley and I were done after an hour, hour and a half. So I could not imagine 6 hours. So that was completely out of the question. So we knew we needed to cut things, but then we have these other questions, right? What do we keep? What do we need to restructure? What do we cut? And how do we actually do that? So I'm going to bring things over to Shelley.
So, as we were reflecting on our training and what to do, the questions Emily just asked, we realized that we were in a traditional instruction method. That's what we had been using. And this method, which is common in higher education and also adult learning, right, it's based on a face-to-face learning structure and has a couple of elements used in different ways, but generally kind of in this order with this amount of time kind of narrowing as it goes. And so it predominates with lecture. So that's content that is being lectured to students, to trainees, and so to try to get content across. Then with less time, there's some discussion. That could be small group discussion, it could be review, but there's less time on that. And then the least time is dedicated to some type of activity, whether that's case applications, different types of activities. We like to do things, for example, where people would try out resources that they would also, so counseling resources, verbal, nonverbal communication. And what's been found with this model is that lectures tend to be long and boring, and that there's limited time for discussion and activity. And this has been found again and again with research. And I don't know your experience, but there's often this sense of, oh no, I ran out of time from teaching and training, and there isn't enough time for activity. And if you scroll over to polls, there is a poll to ask if you have any experience with long and boring lectures as a student, as a instructor or trainer. I know I have experience both as a student and a trainer. Sometimes I feel locked into bad lectures that I'm giving. I'm like, why is this taking so long? So just to get a sense of your experience. So have you sat through long and boring lectures taking up most class time? Yes, as a student, yes, as an instructor, no, neither. So feel free to do that poll. Again, it's if you scroll over from chat in our session, it's under polls. And so reflecting on this, we thought about what are our training needs, right? We're not in higher education, we're training adult learners. And so adult learners, from theories of andragogy, that adults are different than other types of learners, specifically K through 12 and higher education. And our trainers, like other adult learners, are busy with multiple roles and pressures. A lot of people who take our trainings are in other education or training programs. They have sometimes 2 or 3 jobs. They have family responsibilities. So they have very limited time for the training time and kind of mental attention. And like many other adult learners, they need things to be relevant and also to be learning actively. And this kind of passive model of lecture just doesn't really fit the bill, right, in terms of relevancy and active learning. And so the traditional instruction model just falls short in terms of active learning. Again, it's lecture heavy and there tends to be low levels of engagement. And so we, like many others, have turned to alternative instruction methods, and specifically the flipped instruction method. Now, this method, very briefly, has some asynchronous pre-class content where people are acquiring knowledge, and then it's followed up by either synchronous online or face-to-face time where people are constructing their own knowledge. And so the learning structure for flipped instruction, as it says, it flips things on its head, but it has some of the same elements, but the time is inverted. And so you'd start with content, which could be a lecture, which has, because it's pre-recorded and it's pre-class, it's limited to a certain amount of time, followed by discussion. That could be a discussion board, a discussion in class, a review, and then practice and application. And practice and application has the most time, and specifically the most in-class time. And so there is another poll that Omar's going to put that is about whether you're familiar with the flipped instruction model, which you'll again find under polls. And so pre-class content is very important with flipped learning because that's where all your knowledge acquisition is located. And there's many different kinds of pre-class content. There's exercises, media. A lot of people use podcasts and videos, TED Talks, that type of thing, and video lectures. However, in terms of research on flipped instruction, the most common type of pre-class content is video lectures. And some best practices around video lectures, I'm going to talk about in a moment, but video lectures, there's been found to be a student preference over other types of pre-class content, and to be higher levels of engagement, of completing work, of engaging actively in work. And there's various types of video lectures. There are narrated PowerPoints. That's the type Emily and I are going to be talking about, to animations. There's a number of services like Powtown and things. There's kind of, where it's like animated as you're speaking, live drawing. So all these different types of services for lectures, but narrated PowerPoints are the most common. And some of the best practices are for them to be short and interactive. I actually went to a presentation on video lectures this morning, and they were talking about how video lectures should be under 5 minutes. And so we kept ours and tried to under 5 minutes, and then also be interactive. So we had narrated PowerPoints that we recorded, saved as MP4s, uploaded to Kaltura for Canvas, and then added with PlayPosit a layer of interactions. And so we had multiple choice questions, fill in the blank questions, open answer questions. And so that was the way in which we made our lectures short and interactive, which are best practices. And so coming back to the pandemic, thinking about flipped learning in the context of the pandemic, there was a widespread adoption of flipped learning, in part because of the need to move remote and not wanting to kind of lecture on PowerPoint for an hour and a half to 2 hours, which would have been very difficult. Long, unengaging lectures are difficult anyway, but on Zoom or on Teams would have been very difficult. And so I teach part-time in the Rutgers School of Social Work in addition to my work on the Community Support Services program, and Rutgers moved to a 50-90 model. And this was almost universal for all Rutgers School of Social Work classes in 2020 and into 2021. And this model was broken down for 50 minutes of pre-class content. And this pre-class content could include video lectures, exercises, discussion posts. And so that was before class, and then there was a 90-minute Zoom class where people were constructing knowledge. There was an open format that could have a review, discussion, and activities. And what I found was students were actually asking for more review and for me to over lecture because they were used to that lecture format. And I had to be like, okay, I can do a little bit of review, but we really want to focus on those activities. And it'd be great to know if anybody else has had that type of split, the 50-90, if you had a program that moved over to the flipped model, because this was mandated in the School of Social Work.
So Shelley, we do have a question.
Yes. Do your classes count for CEUs? If so, how did you find getting hybrid courses like this approved? So our training does not have CEUs attached to them. Nothing we do. A lot of the people who come to CSS trainings aren't licensed. And the people that we have have multiple licensing boards. And so what we do is we give people certificates, they have the presentations, and they can go to their boards for CEUs, but we're not able to give them based on kind of the needs, the kind of various boards and needs. So great question. So 50 versus 90. Okay. So for example, if I had a class that was on a research methods class that was on measurement, there might be a 50-minute, not 50 minutes, there might be a 15-minute lecture that included things on levels of measurement, best practices in measurement. And then in class, in that Zoom 90-minute class, there might be a short review of that content. And then there'd be some type of a breakout discussion where maybe they would be looking at different measures, critiquing them, discussing what they might use, maybe a case example where they'd have to kind of create a measure to use. And so that changed where the content was, again, in the 50 minutes, they'd be reading, doing a video lecture, and the 90-minute would be that activity, a breakout, they'd construct something, critique something. So those are the type of activities that would be in different places. Great. So the flip model is really been implemented and researched in K-12 and higher education. And what's been found in the literature is that it's at least as effective in terms of learning, and in some cases more effective in terms of student outcomes, and there's also higher levels of engagement. However, there are some challenges with flipped learning, and a lot of those challenges have to do with pre-class content and some equity issues. And in terms of pre-class content issues, there's the issue that not everybody completes them, right? And this was especially found in K-12. And so some of the kids would come in and wouldn't know the content, right? And there was no time to go over it. There's also issues that some students need support. And for anybody who attended the keynote this morning, the discussion about the digital divide and access to technology, comfort around technology, really important issues, but there just isn't really support if people are doing the work at home, and the quality varies drastically. And what's been found in some video lectures is that those same boring, unengaged lectures are just being transferred to video. So you'll still get an hour and a half of someone lecturing with no interactions, and so you have some of those same engagement problems, and they're still long and boring. And there's just been limited research on the flipped model in adult learning. And so, right, I mentioned K-12 and higher education, but there just isn't really a lot written or studied. There hasn't been a lot of research done on training programs like the one Emily and I work on. And so, based on our needs, based on the lack of research, we turn to flipped adaptations. And so there are a variety. There's a lot of lists where teachers have put together how they've adapted flipped to their setting. And that's in part because it doesn't work for everyone, as I mentioned. And so there are needs of specific students. A lot of these adaptations are focused on K-8, especially younger children, and thinking about how the concept of flipped, of having content kind of taken out and then focusing more on activity and discussion, but it doesn't really work with the current model that I mentioned. And so I'm going to talk about two adaptations: in-class flipped and faux-flipped, and then talk about the possibility for adult learners, even though not a lot of research has been done on adult learners. So in-class flipped is from K-12, and it's rotating stations in class. Some of the stations are pre-recorded content, and some of it is actual activities, some group, some individual. It's been found to be effective for its in-class support and time to complete. However, rotating stations for adults didn't make a lot of sense to us, and we were on Zoom. That's more of an in-person thing. And so we turned to, there's just one or two articles on faux-flipped, which is the model we ended up settling on, which are video lectures watched during a class. And there's in-class support. There is time to complete. And so what we found and the way that we adapted this is that we, and Emily's going to give an example, we had 3 to 5 minute lectures with play pause it. We, the training stopped with a break, and we added in, we had people do the video lectures at that point. And the possibility, oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, Michelle. So wait, so which PowerPoint are we looking at? Do you see something that says flipped adaptations in practice? Is that the PowerPoint you all are seeing?
Okay.
Okay.
That's good.
Okay, perfect. There was another question though. Someone asked about what is a rotating station?
Yeah, so if you think, again, as I mentioned, it's more in K-12. And so that would be, for example, you'd have maybe a computer stations around the classroom. And then you'd have students, some would be set up to, let's say, watch a video, watch a recorded lecture, maybe with headphones, and then have other stations where they would do some type of application, have a discussion, do some type of, there's a lot of simulations, games, that type of thing to apply the content. So it's rotating around different types of content and activities. I hope that that's helpful. So possibilities for adult learners. Again, none of this was really designed for adult learners, but we thought with faux-flipped, the time was included. We have busy adult learners, and this was time for them to actually, do the things. And also there was support. Emily and I could be there for technical issues, if there was a browser issue, things like that. And there was also application soon after watching. Again, with multiple roles, people are doing so many things, so many hats, that they could actually use it immediately, right? They would apply something before, they would do something right after because it was in the middle of the training. And we just found that highly effective.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example actually of how we flipped our training. So as Shelley mentioned, we settled on utilizing PlayPosit. And the cool thing about PlayPosit is it includes interactions and a video. So what we did was we took our PowerPoints after we had determined and went through that process of determining what content we wanted to keep in. And in determining that, what we settled on was a lot of the information that we could kind of present that wasn't as interactive, that was more like background information, more about like theories and information that kind of led up to the application piece of our training. We decided to move that into our PowerPoint PlayPosit videos, okay? The information that we felt was more application, where people were able to practice what we were talking about, able to utilize resources that we were giving, have opportunities to practice some of the documentation that is in CSS, because CSS has very specific documentation standards, which the CSS providers love, that we actually kept in the training. So once we kind of figured out what we wanted to use as faux-flipped content and what we wanted to keep in the training, then we went about creating this faux-flipped content. So we developed PowerPoints. From those PowerPoints, we turned them into MP4s, and then we uploaded them into PlayPosit. We weren't sure how it was going to work today with being able to show you an example of this within PlayPosit. So what we're going to do is we're just going to show you a video that I developed that is pretty similar to what we would use in our CSS training. And it's going to explain to you a little bit about CSS training pandemic adaptations. And in this, I'm going to have 2 polls, and I'm going to ask Omar to put those polls up so you all can see them. But in PlayPosit, when we use that, it actually stops the video, whatever interaction it is, whether it be an open-ended question, you can do matching, you can do fill in the blank questions. The interaction actually causes the video to stop, and the person has to complete the interaction before they move on into the rest of it. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm just going to play the video for you all.
CSS training, pandemic adaptations. Prior to the pandemic, the CSS training was a 6-hour-long training with a combination of in-person training, which lasted for around 5 hours, with a combination of training content, exercises, and activities, with a 1-hour break included. For example, in session 2, the activity was around observing and identifying the 4 motivational interviewing processes, as well as change talk. During the pandemic, the training was restructured into a 3-hour training. The training now consists of synchronous training, which averages between 2 hours and 25 minutes to 2 hours and 30 minutes, with a combination of training content, with an emphasis on using polls, videos, sharing resources, and opportunities for practice, as well as an independent work and break. The independent work and break lasts for 25 to 30 minutes and consists of 2 to 4 3 to 5 minute videos with ungraded interactions. For example, session 2 contains a practice activity on using engagement strategies to assess for ambivalence and provides an opportunity for participants to practice using one of the MI resources. During the 25 to 30 minute break, session 2 has 3 videos, 2 focused on motivational interviewing and 1 focused on cognitive behavioral strategies. CSS training topic, motivational interviewing pre-pandemic. Let's compare the training topic of motivational interviewing and how it was presented prior to the pandemic versus now in the asynchronous training. Motivational interviewing was discussed in session 2 in person and was discussed for an hour and 45 minutes. The content topics focused on communication styles, motivational interviewing definition and principles, spirit and processes, change talk and internal motivation, and how to recognize change talk. Session 2 also contained an application piece where participants participated in a conversation role play, as well as an activity around change talk and motivational interviewing principles. CSS training topic, motivational interviewing, pandemic adaptation. Now let's look at how we modified the CSS training, specifically session 2, during the pandemic in an asynchronous format. Session 2 is now held on Zoom, and motivational interviewing is covered over a 45-minute period. The first part of the motivational interviewing section is the content, where MI definitions and strategies are covered. There's also an application piece, which contains a preview of motivational interviewing resources, as well as the readiness ruler resource, which contains an explanation of the resource, a video on how to use the readiness ruler, as well as an activity around the readiness ruler, which is something that CSS training participants can utilize when working with the individuals that they provide services to. Finally, we have our faux-flipped content. The faux-flipped content is around 9 to 10 minutes and has videos on MI spirit and process, as well as motivation.
Sure. So we wanted to give a chance, since we talked about how we broke things down, and as Emily showed in the video, there was a lot less time spent on content, right? As you saw, there were like 5 different content elements, and we really flipped that to just, and Emily actually flipped that content, and she focused on resources, on how to use those resources, best practices of the resources, and it really kind of changed, I feel like, the way that people came away from the content. And so we wanted to give you an opportunity to think about what might you faux flip. Now, it could be also flipped. It doesn't have to be mid-class or mid-training, but what's content that you think would be better served by kind of removing that content from the actual time that you're in video conference lecture like Zoom, or in person if you're back to being in person, so that you can focus more on the application, resources, actually going through the content. And so do you want to click the first?
Oh, I didn't even realize we were back on my screen showing.
Oh, sorry. So is there lecture content you would like to shorten to leave more time to discuss or apply? So just take like 15 seconds. And Emily, you had an example of something you were thinking of, if you wanted to share that.
Yes. So I am a doctoral student currently attending Walden University. And the way the program is designed, it is fully asynchronous. But what is interesting is in the materials that are assigned to the students every week, there are obviously a lot of literature to read. But in addition to the literature, there's also some videos. So again, things that are more applicable. For example, I am in a counseling supervision course this quarter, and there's a video on how to receive feedback from a supervisor and how to give feedback as a supervisor. And as much as the literature we're reading is very helpful, having that video and having that example where that skill is kind of being role played is very helpful to be able to view that when I don't necessarily have that opportunity to meet with any of my professors or have the ability to do something like that in class, which might be something that you might actually do in a in-person class.
Great. So if anybody wants to share in the chat if there's content you're thinking about, I think I gave the example earlier about measurement in research methods. Research methods can be a little dry, so it's important to make sure that students, especially social work students, it's so important, but that they understand research and research methods. But you know, it's hard to get people, especially with like long, boring lectures. And so moving that out, and Emily, if you can click down. So moving that content out, thinking about what it's possible to replace it with. So moving things into a video lecture, which is 3 to 5 minutes, 10 minutes, but then having time to have a discussion to actually, so for example, in my class, we used the general social survey and to actually take a look together at questions, use guidelines from the lecture to critique the questions. That's much more kind of engaging for students. And it also uses higher order thinking. And so thinking about what you could replace lecture content with if you're freed up to have that time by removing it into videos or something else. And thinking about supports or benefits. So as I mentioned, benefits, for example, in my class where students were just more engaged, and for the CSS training the same way. Sometimes from in-person trainings, people would just, especially after lunch, they were 6-hour trainings, just kind of staring at us with blank faces, and having people more engaged and doing activities, asking questions, being like, oh, I could try this resource, was a completely different kind of ball game. However,
people would also leave sometimes. Very upsetting.
Or not leave, but be on their phones.
Yes.
So mentally leave. But there are also barriers and challenges. And many of your settings, it would be hard. I know, for example, I taught at the City University of New York. A lot of people didn't have access to personal computers. They had very limited time. And so being physically in class, they wouldn't necessarily be able to watch content, or they'd have to watch it all together, which wouldn't be as interactive. And so there are some technological barriers. And then also just producing the content. It takes a long time to produce, as Emily, who's our expert producer, knows. There's a lot of skill and time that goes into producing the videos. Emily and I actually wrote an article on the kind of model, because as I mentioned, not a lot of people have been studying flipped and faux-flipped and training. And so we found some results, and this is from program data. This wasn't a research project. It was just, we have data that we capture for our funder, the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services. And so we took a look at kind of pre-pandemic in fall 2019, what we found in 3 areas, and then during the pandemic in fall 2020 and spring 2021. And in 3 areas, the completion of the self-paced content, so those 3 to 5 minute videos, did people watch them? Retention to the midpoint of training. So once people had registered, did they continue with the training? Self-reported knowledge. We always have post-training evaluations. How did they report they understood, they felt comfortable with certain content or skills? And then there were some limitations, as there always are. So in terms of completion of those short 3 to 5 minute videos, we found a 12% higher completion rate than longer out of class videos. So we had some videos that were 15 minutes, 30, 40 minutes, that we had used in the 2019 session, and we found a much higher rate of completion. And then retention to the midpoint of the training. Once we had this model in spring of 2020, spring 2021, there was a 4% higher retention. And then in terms of self-reported knowledge, people reported that they had 10% higher knowledge leaving the training with the faux-flipped adaptation. So again, in fall 2020 and spring 2021. However, this is very limited, our findings, because there were differences in these trainings beyond just using short video lectures that were 3 to 5 minutes, that faux-flipped adaptation. The trainees were different. Their work was different during the pandemic. A lot of people were doing remote working. We actually changed the content in summer 2020. In addition to making the short videos, we actually changed what was in the trainings. And so just a lot of things changed beyond just using short mid-training videos. And there was just no assessment of learning. The play posit modules are ungraded for participation, so it didn't show us whether people understood the content in the play posit modules. And also, there was no pre-evaluation. And so, for example, if people rated that they knew the content well and felt comfortable in the evaluation, they could have come to the training with that knowledge. So we weren't really measuring if they had changed their knowledge. And so it's limited, but I would say it's provocative because not a lot of people are doing research in this area, and there's just a lot of opportunities, I would say, in terms of training uses.
We wanted to talk about how this could be applied, right? What are the implications for practice? How can this be applied? Or why is this relevant to all of you? Why are you sitting here listening to us talk about this? So as an example of that, we're going to look a little bit at our session 4 of the training. So what we ended up finding was session 4 was on skills teaching. And we teach a process called Tell, Show, Do. It's like a 10-step process on how to teach a skill. It's very in-depth. And even though we do this process similarly in our training through Zoom, it just doesn't work. And it just works better in person. The way that we do the activity in the in-person session is a little bit different. We have like 4 to 6 groups. Each group has a different skill. One person learns how to teach the skill, and then the groups alternate and rotate, and each person is then teaching a new group the skill. And people are rotating. What we're doing on the Zoom training is we're just putting people into groups and we're asking them to develop the steps of the skill. And again, a lot of what their work is doing is helping the individual they're working with to develop those steps. But that actual process of having the person teach the skill to this group of people and having the props is just very different and just works a lot better than what we've been seeing in the Zoom training. However, on the reverse end of that, something else we teach in our session 4 is the teach back method. And that method of skills teaching is really for more medical information, is what we kind of discussed with our participants. It's more for, it's skills teaching. The way we teach it is more for concrete skills like brushing your teeth, cooking, things like that. But we have a lot of individuals who live in supportive housing who have medical conditions. So being able to help the person to understand whatever their medical condition is can be very helpful for the person. So we use the teach back method to help the person to understand that. And we haven't seen a difference in this. Again, the activity is a little different on Zoom than how we were having people practice this in person. But again, there was no difference and people seem to be understanding this. In addition to that, this training, since we're doing it on Zoom now, has really had us rethink accessibility. So because we're in Zoom, we can enable closed captioning and subtitling to the trainings, which has been very helpful. In the past, not that we didn't think of accessibility, but we were training in person. And we always gave people the handout of the PowerPoints, or we encouraged people to print them out. We were able to give, if people needed a bigger, PowerPoint, we were able to provide that to them as well. But we didn't really think about individuals with hearing impairment if they needed any extra supports. Whereas now we have the closed captioning enabled within Zoom, which has been very helpful. And then we're also ensuring our materials are screen reader accessible, because again, everything is presented online now. So being able to ensure that any handouts we're giving out to people, being sure to ensure that our PowerPoints are screen reader accessible is something that we're trying to do for all of the trainings we do. And something that we're focusing a lot on. And we've actually gotten some good feedback from participants, whereas in the past, we never really got feedback from participants on accessibility. There was only one time before Shelly and I actually started doing the training where there was somebody who needed accommodations to attend the training, but that's never come up. But it's kind of made us question whether or not it hasn't come up because people, maybe were afraid to ask, or because we weren't offering these things. But now that we're offering them, we're getting a lot of good feedback on it.
Yeah, and I would just say we were quite reactive. So people had to opt into accessibility, and now we just make it clear, and we have to actually have information at the start of every presentation about what we're doing for accessibility, and if there's something more someone needs that they can reach out, or any questions about accessibility. So we're being much more proactive about it, which has been a great change. Mm-hmm. So also some of the research implications I'll just go over quickly, because I do think that this is an area that needs more research. As I mentioned, there's just not a lot on training with flipped or faux-flipped. And I should just say, I spoke to a former professor at Rutgers Graduate School of Education. And she was like, do you really want to call it faux-flipped? It sounds fake, like a fake handbag. And I was like, no, it's like, non-dairy milk. It's like different ingredients for different needs. Maybe someone has a dairy sensitivity, but it kind of has very similar uses. And that's the thing. This is just something for people who need something different than flipped, because there's so much on flipped, but it just doesn't work well for everyone in every situation. And so we're suggesting that more needs to be done in this area that we looked at in terms of actual learning, because as we mentioned, we didn't look at learning at all. And so thinking about how you could have recorded lectures with graded interactions that show whether the people are understanding, able to apply some of the information, and then also having pre and post evaluations, which will help to show if people report, this is all self-reported, of course, report that they've gained additional knowledge. Additionally, there just needs to be more on flipped and faux-flipped in training. And specifically, again, we're in work-based training, but looking at what is possible. And so looking at different types of modifications, right? As I mentioned, in-class flipped and faux-flipped, those are only 2. Some people say there are 7, there are 9, right? There's lots of different modifications people are doing. And some of these might work in different settings. And this was just our kind of on the fly form of faux-flipped. Maybe there is something different that works better. Again, ours is focused on if you have video conferencing and then pause the video conferencing and do something else and come back, that this might look very different if we were in person, which we're not yet. And also just looking more at outcomes and different measures of outcomes. I mentioned we looked at engagement, retention, but there are other ways to look at the outcomes of learning. And then finally, just developing mid-training content, which I mentioned is one of the weak spots of flipped learning, of having high quality pre-class, or in our case, mid-training content. And so thinking about what are the video lectures, and are there options beyond narrated PowerPoints? And we have read literature that what's happening is that people are narrating PowerPoints, and it's basically the same as kind of poor quality in-class lectures, which we hope we're not doing. And you can let us know what you thought of our short little video. We're, trying to add interactions. We're trying to make it more interactive, but there is this concern of just narrating PowerPoints is doing a very similar thing to the kind of traditional instructional model that didn't always work for people, especially adult learners. And so we're now going to wrap things up in terms of bringing things together. And went back instead of forward, and thinking about future direction. So Emily, I don't know if you wanted to.
So for us, in considering future directions, we don't really know yet if we're going to be able to do the training in person on campus again, and what that would look like. Since we restructured everything back in 2020, we actually went from an 8-week training to a 9-week training. So we added in another week of online content. And in addition to that, our trainings are now condensed into 3 hours. So something that we've kind of been talking about in preparation for us potentially being able to do this in person in the fall is, how do we do that, right? And a lot of our activities, again, are based off of being on the computer, right? Our training is something that is actually being done on the computer. So even thinking about how we would go from presenting this content as we normally do on the computer versus how we would do it in person is something else we're considering. So we don't have the answer to those questions. Shelley, myself, and our other training facilitator, Earl, have a lot we have to talk about, but that's kind of where we're at in terms of what this training might potentially look like in the future. But we're not going back to 6 hours. We definitely know we're not doing that, right, Shelley?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say that training is different than higher education. And so we had low engagement before, right? And so the findings that we had in terms of increased engagement, increased retention generally with remote learning, those aren't found in higher education, right? There's actually a drop in engagement, a drop in all these things. But because we have low engagement to begin with, this improved things that in other areas weren't being improved, especially in higher education. The same thing with K-12, there was a lot of students not showing up, of work not getting done, and we kind of saw the inverse effect. And so training is a different kind of thing than K-12 and higher education, in part because while our training is mandated by the division, that doesn't mean people are necessarily participating or being retained. And we actually lose a lot of people that actually just quit their jobs in the middle of the training. Every training session, there's people who email us or don't email us and, have found other jobs. And so it's a tough landscape. And so we wanted to kind of open things up to think about how this could be used in your teaching or training. Because again, like these are our specific situations where we had video conferencing for 3 hours, we had a half an hour break where there was some content. But I mentioned to Emily earlier this week, I'm going to be teaching a course over the summer where I'm going to use short interactive videos, but it's not going to be in the middle of the class. I'm going to give it's in higher education, it's undergraduate students, and I'm going to give them before the class, right? Because there's just like higher rates of access to the technology and an expectation of doing pre-class work. And so this adaptation, I'm going to take best practices of some of the technology, the video best practices, but use it a little differently. And that's what there's some flexibility in this. It's just kind of what worked with our specific trainees at the time. And so we wanted to open things up for the minute or two that we have to see if you had any questions. So Michelle, how did you measure and report results for those work-based training topics? So we use post-training evaluations through Qualtrics. And so we generally have our questions match our learning objectives. So identify, define, evaluate, apply, and then that's presented as what we're training, and then to see how people rate, whether they can identify, whether they can evaluate, whether they can try. Oh, that's an excellent question. Our response rate did go up, and it generally goes down over the training, but it's usually somewhere between, I would say at the beginning, we're like, 2/3, and it goes down to probably about a half in the period that we're talking about. Is that about?
Yeah, I would say that's correct. And prior to this, I would 100% say people were not really completing the evaluations. We were doing paper evaluations, and we had to actually sit there and not let anybody leave the room to get them to respond to the evaluation. And then prior to the pandemic, we tried to do an online evaluation, and we did not get many responses to it.
Because people were doing them on their phones. It was a QR code. And honestly, just having the links in the chat, more people are looking at the PowerPoints, more people are doing the evaluation. So again, based on training is just tough. The people are mandated to be there, but there's nothing they're not getting CEUs necessarily. And so it is kind of a challenge to keep people engaged, which is why we were so excited to see these increases in retention and other things.
Jacqueline, that's definitely something we could look into. The way that we have our certificates is all of our Zoom trainings have one certificate that they get, because again, it's 9 weeks that we're doing the training, and 7 of those weeks are Zoom sessions. People get the certificate for 7 weeks, and then they get individual certificates for the asynchronous weeks. They have to complete the module in order to get those certificates. What I will say though is it's very interesting, because we know our response rate for the evaluation is very good. But the other thing that we do, which is interesting, is we use Box. So all of our documents that we share, all the resources that we share, we actually have them linked in our Box account, and we use a shareable link that we give to participants, and we're able to look at the access stats to see if people are actually viewing the resources and viewing the documents, which is also something that's been helpful to us to be able to see if people are actually utilizing the information that we're giving them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also has the download rate, which is nice to see who's viewing, because you see people click on them, but actually downloading is really interesting to see. it looks like we're past time. So thank you to everyone for coming. We're happy to stay on a little bit if anyone has more questions.
Yeah, thank you again, Emily and Shelley. Of course, if you guys have any more questions, please feel free to throw them into the chat. All the sessions today have been recorded, so you can access them again at a later point. Yeah, thank you again. I believe there's one more session of different things coming up at 4:30. I know there's a panel coming up. But yeah, thank you again, Emily and Shelley. It was really great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.